print. I've got to learn how to do that.
You know, I could have put down a fair amount of money and made a bet as to who the teacher was. Been right.
I mean, that's magnificent.
Well, good morning to everyone, and good morning to all of those on line. It's a Utah reminder that it is not spring yet outside. I want to thank Steve for his class for the last few months on John. It was just really great, and I got to watch the finale. Was that it's not the penultimate, it's the ultimate episode. And it was just a very fulfilling class. I'm appreciative to Steve to doing that. We're going to do another textual study for the next 8 weeks. And we're going to start that this morning. I had a question all ready to go, and Steve kind of beats me to it. He has all these questions about movies. And so he's gone through the romantic movies and the Westerns. I have a little bit narrower genre, sports movies. Do you have any particular sports? And sports, for some people, is a very wide category. It includes things that are barely sports. But do you have any particular? Yes. Hold it. Remember?
Remember the Titans.
Okay. So that was
there's much more about than sports.
So there was a movie and then a huge TV series that followed.
Yeah, I know it's a little on the questionable side, but it's called The Replacements. It's got a lot of funny stuff in it, but anyway, it's a little.
What sport is that about?
Football.
Football. Okay.
Hoosiers.
Hoosiers, and that is the right answer, by the way. For anybody from the Midwest, that is the ultimate, not even the penultimate, it is the ultimate sports movie. What's that? Yeah, okay. Any other sports movies?
Rudy.
Rudy, made by the same people who did Hoosiers, actually. And it's also based in Indiana as well, Notre Dame. Oh, Wanda's a sports person.
No, I'm not. The Blind Side.
The Blind Side, okay. Yes, that's, I had not thought about that one, but yeah. One of the things that I like about a lot of sports movies, particularly Hoosiers, because I am a Hoosier at heart, although I've lived here a whole lot longer than I ever lived in Indiana, was that it's a movie about redemption. It's about second chances. And there are a lot of characters in that movie particularly who need second chances. And I can think of a whole lot of other sports movies, Rocky, The Natural,
Spartacus,
Seabiscuit, all who are underdog movies who are in need of some sort of redemption. And sports movies kind of become a cliche that way because there's always the big match or the big race, the big game at the end that brings about some redemption to it. And it makes for very unapologetically good time feeling for a lot of sports movies like that. We're going to be talking about 2 Corinthians this morning, which is a movie which is a book, a letter. Maybe they'll make it into a movie someday. About second chances, about redemption, about the church at Corinth, and we're going to see a little bit about that this morning. If you will, would you pray with me? Father, thank you for this morning, for the chance for us to be together with brothers and sisters and in your body. And we just pray that as we study your word this morning, you will bring it to life. You will give us new insights into what you want us to know and for how you want us to live. And we just say these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. So we're going to look at three things this morning with regard, just as an introduction to the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, I mean, it's second, so we're kind of in the middle of a story. And it's a very interesting story. And so we're going to talk about the city of Corinth just briefly, to whom the church there, the letter was addressed. We'll talk about the city, the church, and then the apostle and his relationship with people at Corinth. Today we would call this entire area Greece. Back in New Testament times, it wasn't called Greece. It was an area that was roughly defined in two areas. The top part from Philippi all the way over, including Thessalonica and Berea, was all called Macedonia. Luke talks a lot about Macedonia in Acts, and Paul talks a lot about Macedonia and going through there on his journeys in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. The lower part down here was called Achaia, and it was where the two biggest cities of Greece were, which were Athens and Corinth. Sparta was also down there. And whereas Athens was kind of the intellectual capital of Greece, that was what it was. It was known for its sophistry, really. It was also known for its religion. Paul found that out when he showed up. And there was just a ton of religious things out there, idols. And Corinth is a lot, it has a lot of the same qualities, but it's different. And it's really defined by its geography. As we read through Acts in particular, when Paul is on his missionary journeys, they spend a lot of time walking, okay? But if he wanted to get somewhere fast, how did he get there? Ship, because that was the international airports weren't really a thing back then. So in order to get around, you traveled by boat, but you couldn't always travel year round. Winter was treacherous, particularly on the Mediterranean Sea. And Paul talks about wintering at places, waiting for the weather to improve so he can move on to somewhere else. And so this tended to be kind of down here where Crete and Cyprus tended to be kind of a dangerous place at certain times of the year. So when there was trade going on from the Aegean Sea, which was between what is now Turkey, they called it Asia back then. We'll also call it Asia Minor. To get the stuff from here over toward Rome and the West, and Italy is kind of up here, there was a shortcut. So they didn't have to go all the way down around. There's this little thing right here. It's a little land bridge, and it's only about 3 or 4 miles long. And so when a lot of the trade came through this way, they brought it to the port of Cenchrea, I think is how they pronounce it. And Paul talks about that. They unload the stuff, they put it on carts, they take it across the 3 miles, load it back on ship, and then it continues on its way west. It sounds like a real pain to do that over 3 or 4 miles, but it was much faster than going around the south way. So Corinth is on that trade route. And so there are a lot of different kinds of people that live in Corinth. There are Jews there. It's mostly a Gentile city. It is a Greek city, made up a lot of the traditional Greek thought, but it's also a Roman colony as well as part of the Roman Empire. So there's a real mix of people in Corinth, and it's a large city. And so Paul spends a lot of time there, and he spends a lot of time writing to that church. Turn to Acts 18. At the end of Paul's second missionary journey, if you'll recall, he's having a good and a bad time on his second missionary journey. He's had some difficulty in Philippi. He goes to Thessalonica and has a lot of good response to his message. He also has a lot of bad response, which Jesus also, whenever Jesus was preaching, he tended to polarize people. Paul's message did the same thing. And the people at Thessalonica, it was kind of a Paul thing. They really didn't like him. And so they pretty much told him to leave. And he said, fine, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. He said that on more than one occasion. So they went to Berea. And Berea was a real fertile ground for him. And he was with Silas and Timothy at the time. But the people at Thessalonica so disliked Paul and his message that they followed him. They came down to Berea and made a big mess there. And so Silas and the brothers at the church at Berea, which said, you need to get out of here. So they put him on a boat and they sent him down this way. Now, I don't know whether Athens was on Paul's original itinerary or not, but he shows up in Athens all by himself. And that's all recorded in Acts chapter 17. And it is a fascinating time that Paul is in there. And then following that, he goes to Corinth, and he's still by himself when he gets there, but not for long. So Acts chapter 18, I'm going to just read these very quick. It's going to take us 2 minutes to read Acts chapter 18 and Paul's first encounter at Corinth. Reading out of the NIV. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. And when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And so Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one's going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." And so Paul stayed for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God. And while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. "This man," they charged, "is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law." And just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." And so he had them ejected from the court. And then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatever. And Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time, and then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. So, for a church, Paul spent how long there? Year and a half, 18 months. With the exception of Ephesus, he stayed there longer than any other place that we know about from Scripture. So he's there a long time, which means he's going to come to know these people pretty well. And so he's there for a long time, but things don't go well from there, I think it's safe to say. Part of the problem we have with 1st and 2nd, and if I were really smart, we would have done 1 Corinthians first, but we would have still been talking about this in 2025, because, I mean, he writes 29 chapters to the church at Corinth. Not that they were chapters back then, but he and that's not all. He wrote other things to them as well. So he has a vested interest in the people there. So you all know about Corinth. You've read 1 Corinthians before over and over again, right? In a word, in Paul's time, once he leaves Corinth, and like he's over at Ephesus, he's the travel agent for people like Timothy and Titus and Aristarchus. He just sends them out all over the place. But he also gets word from Corinth that things aren't well. In a word, how would you describe the church at Corinth after Paul leaves? It was a mess. That's exactly the word. I mean, if you want, read 1 Corinthians. You've all read it. What's going on? When Paul addresses the church in 1 Corinthians, what's one of the things he talks about?
Well, there's a big division there. Rich and poor, who they're following, who they weren't following. They were dividing over everything. And he talks about the exact thing that Jesus talked about. Your message is diluted or gone because there's no unity.
Okay, so somehow in the intervening months after he leaves, there's just divisiveness, and it permeates the whole body there. What else was going on that he addressed?
Wait.
Well, there's like Mark said, it's a mess. So one of the things they were accepting and celebrating sexual immorality and sin is a big problem that they have. And then there's also a big problem in that they were more concerned for themselves than they were for each other. And that gets manifest in the way they celebrate the Lord's Supper and in the way that they demonstrate spiritual gifts.
Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. Which is why 1 Corinthians is such a long letter. Anything else that you can think of that Paul addresses that
His own apostleship.
okay.
He has to defend it.
Okay, so in addition to all these things, he's got a big problem with himself, essentially, and with people's perception of who he is. And so much like, and Randy's talked about this in his class on Galatians, because they also have an issue. It's slightly different in context, but once he leaves, people who come in after him, or just people in the church, teachers come in and they say, we're not so sure that Paul is really an apostle. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that have happened, and I think. There's another thing. The brothers were having issues with each other. What were they doing? They were suing each other. They were taking brothers to court.
I want to point out that we should not take on the example of Sosthenes and the Jews, because he was their attorney. And when they lost, they beat him up. Now, that was my experience this past week with a few clients, but just want to point that out.
You just have a soft spot for Sosthenes, don't you? Yeah, you do. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that.
Dave,
Yes.
one thing that it seems to be overarching, and it's human nature. It happens today, and I would say maybe it happens as much in young, flexible minds as it does in older calcified minds. We don't like change. We don't like anything that doesn't match with what we're used to. So the Jewish, those steeped in Judaism didn't want anything that didn't align with Judaism. Those that came from other cultures wanted to bring what was familiar to them. So Corinth, being a melting pot, was either going to be an unmitigated success or a mess.
Well, it seems like that it was a success to begin with, and then it quickly went downhill as soon as Paul left. There was also in 1 Corinthians, Paul spends a lot of time talking about Christian liberty and what that means and what that doesn't mean, and what they. Part of the culture in Corinth was that it was important to be seen and noticed, to have status. If you were going to be a political force in Corinth, it was important to have a good job, like a litigator, to be rich, to have a good job, to have influence. Thank goodness that has changed in our culture today. But the people who came in after Paul, whether it was people that were already in the church, and you've got to think, Corinth was a wealthy city because it was a trade capital. There were lots of rich people there. And so I have to think that some of those rich people were actually part of the church. And this might come into play later on, because at the same time all this is going on, there is something going on back in Jerusalem where the saints are in need back there. And Paul wants to develop a collection, because that's a soft spot for him. And he wants to take a collection back there. And so he's enlisted the help of Macedonia, the churches in Macedonia and the churches in Corinth, all of which have said, yes, we'll be glad to help you take care of that. Churches in Macedonia followed through. Church in Corinth was dragging their heels and not following through with that. So, and there's a certain time sensitiveness to that as well. So there's a lot going on in Corinth once Paul leaves, and he's up for a lot of the times where he writes 1 Corinthians, probably from Ephesus, because he spent 3 years in Ephesus. And shortly after where the text leaves off, Apollos shows up, which is a good and a bad thing, because Apollos comes to Ephesus. He gets involved with Priscilla and Aquila. And finally he says, I want to go to Corinth. And Paul and everybody says, that sounds like a great idea. So Apollos then goes, and apparently Apollos is just the antithesis of what Paul is. Paul says he's not a very good speaker. He admits that. He's not very charismatic. Both those qualities are highly valued by the elite, the elitist people in Corinth, but Apollos is. And of course, the divisiveness that happens involves Apollos as well, because some people are saying, you know, I'm following Apollos, I'm following Paul, I'm following Peter, I'm following Jesus. That's what's led to this division. So a lot of the qualities that are respected in Corinth, having a good job, being rich, does Paul fit into that category? He's what? He's a tent maker, not a very valued, well, unless it started raining, then some people would, I suppose, want. But it's not a lot of prestige. And so they don't think much of Paul. And besides, Paul points this out in 1 Corinthians, and he will bring it up later in 2 Corinthians. He didn't charge them for preaching. And the higher ups, the elitists, thought, why would you not do that? That's crazy. So the only thing he's really got going for him is his education. And he doesn't really flaunt that at all. But the people there in Corinth, the ones who are coming in after him, are saying, look, he's a tent maker. Can't talk good. He's not rich. He doesn't have any money. And he's wishy-washy. And we're going to get into that next week. And so he's unreliable. Why would you want to listen and follow his words? So this presents a problem to Paul. Do you know anybody else, any other writer in the New Testament whose letters that we have, who's more humble than Paul is with regard to who he is in his calling? I think he says he's the least of the apostles, right? But now people are calling his apostleship into question. And why is that a dilemma for Paul? Why is that awkward for Paul?
I think the very thing that he tried to gets very too long. Yeah, he likes to. It forces him to explain who he is and what he's been through, and I don't think he's completely comfortable doing that, because I think this is my own editorial, because I think he has a problem about pride, and that he fights to keep pride out of his life, and to defend his apostleship, he has to start to boast about the things that he's done, his education, and the things that he's endured.
I think that's exactly right. He's not, that's the last thing he wants to talk about is himself, right? And he spends almost the part of the book we're not going to get to talking about that, chapters 8 on. It's all about him.
It doesn't say this explicitly, but he's got a past that's pretty awful. He's advocating killing Christians, and now he's saying you need to be a Christian. So that I don't know if that goes with your wishy-washiness, but when you've got a past like that, I think he's probably, while he's there, it's not recorded, of course, has to explain himself all the time, how he's had to change, and the fact that he wasn't with Jesus. And so now he's called an apostle, but he wasn't with Jesus, totally different type of person than the other apostles were.
Yeah, I think they tend to pick that apart. And so he really has to, and we're going to talk more about this. For me, this really becomes the first half of the letter is really about Paul's ministry. If he is called into question for his apostleship, what else suffers?
His message.
The message. And so this is his life, and we're going to talk more about this. I mean, for Paul, Damascus changed everything. And he had a ministry before Damascus, and somebody changed that when on his way to Damascus. And so he says more than once, I am compelled, which is a very strong word, to preach. That he just felt that was his very essence, his being. If his apostleship, if his credibility, if his reliability is called into question, then his message is called into question. And I think he hates that. And so part of what 2 Corinthians addresses in two different ways is one, as Steve points out, he has to boast. He qualifies that about his preaching and about his background, as Mark points out, and about what he's doing now. But he also talks about why his message is so important. So those two things are really wired together. And
I think there's a flip side.
hold on just a sec.
You need to be amplified.
There's a flip side to that. I think that all the things that have happened to him, shipwrecked, stoned, whipped, his history, all, when you look at our mass people that attract Jesus seekers, he had the authority to talk. His life demonstrated how devoted he was to Jesus and the ministry, and although he might be prideful in some respects, he also suffered more than most other ministers of Christ.
I think that's exactly right. And again, I think he really.
And the other thing is that it draws people to him. His message.
They draw it. His message is what he wants to highlight. He doesn't want to highlight his personal background, but they're intertwined, and he can't help it. And so, I think the fact that he knows that he has to defend himself at some level, and he will say, you know, if you want to look at my words, look at my lifestyle. Do they match? And that really is what it comes down to, the crux of his defense, other than he's just doing what the Lord told him to do. And so, Paul's got a lot on his hands. Now, what happens is, and I'm going to hand out a possible timeline because nobody's in agreement. There are lots of things that happened with Paul's relationship with the Church at Corinth that we have very little or no record. But he mentions things about, I mean, it's very possible we have 3rd and 4th Corinthians out there, that letters that we don't have. And he references a letter that he wrote in 1 Corinthians. He says, the previous letter I wrote to you, blah, blah, blah. So there was another letter out there. And then in 2 Corinthians, we'll get to in a couple of weeks, he talks about a sorrowful letter that he wrote to them. So there are some things that are out there. And plus, he says, I made a visit to you that's unrecorded by Luke or anybody else after he wrote 1 Corinthians. And Timothy came back to him and said, things aren't going well in Corinth. And so he says, I need to make a quick trip over to Corinth. Well, that didn't go well, apparently. And we have no real record of that except Paul's reference to it once. And so there's a lot that goes on, and it's not surprising considering how much time he spent there and how much he wrote. And so this is just more for your reference, I guess. This is one person's think so with regard to Paul's writings and his. So don't take this as gospel, because it is not. There are a lot of references in here to Scripture, because we have all of Acts. We have both Corinthian letters, and we have other letters where Paul talks about people being at Corinth or brothers. That's part of his missionary team. And so we have a lot of information, but there are a lot of missing pieces. And so this is just, if you wanted to, you don't have to put much stock in it, but it does help in some ways give us an idea of Paul's coming and going, because Church at Corinth meant, it's obvious it meant a lot to him for a lot of different reasons. And that's why he spent so much time writing to them back in. Do you need more? Okay, sorry. There are a lot of people there. There's a lot of things he needs. He's got to address all these things. He has to address his apostleship. He's got this collection he wants to take to Jerusalem. And he's not in an email age or a telephone age. He can't just pick up the phone and talk these things out like we might do. There may have been a time, I don't know about any of you, who had long distance relationships with family or other people, and there might have been a disagreement, and you tried to work that out and apologize or straighten things out by letter writing, and it is a slow process, and you can't read the other person's demeanor by letter writing. And so when we start reading 2 Corinthians, Paul has had all this background. He's maybe made an emergency trip to Corinth. He's written a couple of letters to them, including 1 Corinthians, outlining a whole bunch of things that aren't right. And Timothy has come back and said things still aren't right. So he sends Titus out. And he sends Titus from Ephesus, and he says, go through Macedonia and end up at Corinth and come back and tell me how things are. That is where we are when 2 Corinthians opens up. So for next week, I would ask you as your homework assignment to read the first chapter of 1 Corinthians and tell me, or 2 Corinthians, sorry. We're assuming you know everything about 1 Corinthians already, so you don't have to study it. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we're going to talk about that. Tell me what you think Paul's emphasis, he has several emphases in the first chapter, but he's introduced. And for me, 2 Corinthians is Paul's most personal letter. It's a letter I go to a lot for encouragement, because there is a lot of encouraging text in there. And I think we're going to see that. And we're just going to study the first half of 1 Corinthians over the next 8 weeks up until mid-May. Somebody wants to do the second half, they're welcome to. But we're going to focus on that. And so I appreciate all of your comments, and I will look forward to being in class with you next week for chapter 1. Thank you.